everyone, it's Jessie from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. If you're new to my channel, I'm a first-year cut flower farmer in New Jersey in Zone 6B, and I typically make videos focusing on the business side of flower farming, especially for that smaller cut flower farmer. If you're following me, then you probably realize that I didn't have a market video for last week, and for good reason. I was up in Vermont for an in-person farm visit for a live portion of a workshop that I signed up for earlier this year called the Tulip Workshop. So this tour was up in Vermont, which is just under 6 hours away from me. So when I saw that there was a live option for just a few $100s more, it's like, sign me up. I'm a more interactive learner and I like to see things being done with the ability to interact and ask questions. I tend to ask a lot of questions. So I wanted to do a video talking about that in-farm tour experience, a little bit about the Tulip Workshop. This is not a sponsored, or I'm not getting paid to talk about this, but I do want to make it clear, I'm not talking about the specifics of tulip forcing. I'm not going to be talking about the process or anything like that. The two women who ran this workshop, Emily von Trapp and b.a.r.e, they've spent years and a lot of time investing their knowledge into this workshop. So if it is something that sounds interesting to you, I definitely would recommend you looking into it. So I want to talk a little bit about, one, why it makes business sense for you to consider something like this that is a little bit not traditional in terms of how we grow tulips. Two, who this is good for. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure expectations, because I think that is actually something that is really important for people before they sign up, to think about whether or not it's feasible for them to force tulips. Like if you're in an apartment, it's probably gonna be very, very difficult. Not that I think anyone's flower farming in an apartment, but you get what I'm saying. And three, I do want to talk a little bit about this out of the box thinking that I was forced to do by just observing what was going on at Emily's farm. So those are three things I want to cover in this video. Let's talk about why tulips. Most of us know of tulips as this spring crop that comes up sometime in April or May for most of us living in the northern climates. It's hard for people to grow tulips who live in a warmer climate, because tulips need a dormancy phase of cool weather to basically kick them out of that dormancy to be able to grow. Now, that being said, tulips are what they call a highly programmable crop, meaning that you can trick the tulip to grow at a certain time or give them the right conditions to grow. So that's where tulip forcing comes in, because instead of getting your crop in the spring, you can basically cut off some time, as long as they've been given their appropriate cooling period, to jumpstart the process and potentially get tulips as early as Christmas in some cases. And for most people, it's really trying to hit the Valentine's Day market. So that is the huge reason why it makes business sense. I signed up for this workshop before we even, I think, put an offer on this house. I knew that I wanted to flower farm. You know, in retrospect, probably not a good idea. I probably should have had the space to do it first, right? I'll talk about the infrastructure piece later, but it made so much business sense to me, because one of the main holidays that we're not able to capture for most of us flower farmers in the Northern Hemisphere is Valentine's Day. That is in mid-February. In mid-February, unless if you're out in California or maybe a very southern climate, you're not growing anything, right? So the majority of the market for flowers is coming internationally. When you have the ability to force grow something like a tulip in February, that is where the money is at in a time like Valentine's Day, right? So you grow the right varieties, you grow something that is not traditional in terms of something that's a little bit more specialty, and you've really got a recipe for capturing a market, because there really is no other local market competition out there. So we've talked about how tulips are highly programmable, right? And then we've also talked about how the timing of it is ideal, because besides Valentine's Day, During the winter months, especially if you're in a place where you don't get a lot of sun or it's just all the snow, it's all cold, people are craving for a little taste of summer or even spring in this case, right? They want that color, they want that freshness. So if you're able to provide it to them in a high quality product such as tulips, where, you know, if you're doing things right, you should really be able to get a vase life of around 10 days or even more. You know, it's a recipe for success. So for me, it made total business sense. And there is always a question out there around, are tulips profitable? Because we have to treat them as annual crops. In tulip forcing, you are still treating them as an annual crop. And I would argue that it is more profitable to be able to force tulips than to grow them in the spring when everyone else is growing them and selling them, right? Because again, you don't have competition if you're the only person who is forcing tulips. Forcing tulips has gotten a little bit more popular, but it's still not popular enough where even most flower farmers are aware of this concept. So hopefully that was compelling enough for a business sense point of view. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is just the infrastructure piece. So in order to force tulips, you need to give them that cooling period, right? And when we talk about cooling period, we're talking about they need to have at least that like 12 to 15 weeks of cooling that is under 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You need to be able to have the infrastructure to provide that. When I say infrastructure, obviously I live in New Jersey. It gets down to those temperatures sometime in December, right? So having a shed, my garage, right? Those are all appropriate. But if you're down, let's say in Florida or in Southern California, where the temperatures are never going to get down there, you ideally need some sort of infrastructure, even if it is a walk-in cooler or a cool bot, to be able to mimic those conditions. And if you don't have that ability, then, you know, I would do a little bit more thinking around, okay, how could I potentially get there to make it worth the investment to take this course? Because I will say that I think there are a few people who took this course thinking that, okay, like I can force tulips in the winter, you know, I have artificial lights. It's a little bit more than just growing seedlings under lights is what I'm trying to say, right? So you need to be able to either artificially cool those bulbs, or you need to be able to be in a climate where you can leverage the free climate outdoors to be able to cool those bulbs. And then the second piece of infrastructure that you need is a place to grow them. And we're talking about a place that is between 50 degrees and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I feel like a lot of us do have that already in place because we all start seeds in the winter. You know, hopefully you're not starting seeds below 50 degrees, right? So, you know, as long as the ambient temperature has a 20-degree range, which is pretty flexible. And of course you need artificial lights, right? So assuming that you hit those 2 points, you should be able to force tulips, right? And here's the other thing, you know, you don't necessarily need a giant space. That's one of the things that the workshop talks to you about. Because you would be forcing in crates or hydroponically, you can stack up crates. Every crate, we'll call it, fits, you know, 60-ish bulbs, right, for easy math. So if you just did 4 crates, 240 tulips, right? So, you know, you can make it work. Even if your footprint is really small. But what I'm trying to say is that if you live in Southern California and you don't have a cooler, you're probably not going to make it work, even if you had the space to do it, right? Because now you're just trying to figure out a different input in terms of how to get it cool. So that was the second point, right? Having that infrastructure before you take the leap to take the course. The course itself, before I get on to thinking out of the box, I believe when I took it was $1,500, but that also included the on-site farm visit. I believe the course, if you don't opt in for that live visit, is something around $1,200. So the recommendation is that for your first year, you trial something like 3,000 tulips to start with to make back your investment and more. 3,000 tulips in the grand scheme of flower farmers is a drop in the bucket. I mean, Emily, who is one of the hosts of the workshops is doing like 200,000, definitely on the extreme end of high productivity. The other host was Linda. She, I believe, is scaling back to 50,000, so still a very large amount. I was just watching You Can't Eat the Grass unboxing their tulip order of, I think it was 18,000 tulips. So you can see, you know, someone like You Can't Eat the Farm is a specialty flower farmer now. You know, they're doing pretty high volume of 18,000, but at the workshop, it wasn't unreasonable to hear a lot of people doing a few thousand, right? So I just want to make clear that 3,000 sounds like a big number, but it isn't. Every crate has about anywhere from 500 to 700. So it's not a ton of crates if you wanted to do 3,000. I mean, we're talking about 6 crates, right? So putting it out into perspective, you know, you can easily fit 6 crates into a very small footprint. I mean, I could probably fit the 6 crates if you look back here on that coffee table, assuming that I stacked it, just for reference. All right, so that brings me to point number 3, which is this concept of thinking outside the box. And I think what really struck me when I went on the farm site, so this was Emily's farm, Emily von Trapp. So we went to the Von Trapp greenhouse, and just seeing how she grows in Vermont, which is a relatively short window of growing time. I mean, if you think about it, they really have a condensed growing season. So she has had the greenhouse infrastructure set up from her parents' business, who were in the horticulture and nursery business. So, you know, she did have a leg up in that sense, but she was someone who, it sounded like from the get-go, was always challenging, well, conventionally people do it this way, but how could I do it a little bit different to get more out of my season? So one example, the very first thing we looked at was her anemone crop. She grows anemone from seed because she wants to be able to hybridize them for, you know, more cool varieties, but also to her climate. She is growing thousands of anemones that have already started to bloom and will continue blooming into the late spring of next year. We typically think of anemones as a fleeting spring crop. You know, she's getting 6+ months out of it, right? So the only way that she's able to do it is to think outside the box and think about how she's able to really extend her growing season. She's started getting into lilies and thinking about how they're programmable, how to jumpstart the process and extend their season. So she really carries this out for a bunch of other stuff. She's mentioned that, you know, the way that she's growing anemones is also the way that she could be growing ranunculus. She just really hasn't had the time to implement it. But it was just taking this concept of, you know, that anemones and ranunculus are cool weather crops, right? So they're cool weather crops that are also driven by daylight. So you obviously need a certain level of daylight in order for something to grow. But at the same time, you know, she was saying for anemones, you know, they just need a couple of days a week that's sun and that's not cloud. And then they need to minimally heat their greenhouse. And then they have anemones for basically the entire year, right? And I think that was a little bit mind-blowing to some of us who are just growing anemones for a month or two, or maybe more than a month, but you know, you get what I'm saying, right? For the spring. There was another one where her dahlias, right? So by no means is she focusing on dahlias as a main crop, but she talked about just how this concept of digging up tubers, storing them, and all of that labor involved is a little bit mind-blowing to her because it's so much work. And in her climate, it makes 0 sense because by the time the dahlias are ready, she's about to get her frost. So what she does is when she does plant dahlias, like for her own enjoyment, she's putting them in these big pots. And I'll put a picture up here, but this is a monster dahlia. She doesn't divide it. She basically just overwinters it in the pot. And that allows her to save time. It does not disrupt the tuber, you know, basically allows it to kind of overwinter in a non-freezing environment to be able to produce these types of blooms. And she made this point where she ever considered growing dahlias at a fuller scale, she would still do it in pots, and then she wouldn't dig them up. She would just leave them in the pots and bring them out for the next season and continue doing so. I was actually talking to a friend about this, and she said that makes a lot of sense. Dahlias have relatively short roots, so totally doable in a pot of that size and getting a massive return on the number of blooms. What else did she talk about? She talked about just, like in her garden, this is more of like a family garden her dad started. They're very, deliberate about where they place certain things. So they have like lilacs as a shield from the wind, which helps minimize the amount of weeds or weed seeds coming in. It really made me think about my field, and my field is out in this open area. There is a deer fence, but what can I do in the outside rows, potentially as like perennials, to create that level of protection from weed seeds blowing in to the rest of my field to minimize my weeding. So I think as I continue this no dig culture and putting mulch on, I'm going to potentially reduce the amount of weeds that come up from seed that was in the ground, but that doesn't mean that the wind's not going to blow seed onto my field, right? So just thinking about how I could use nature to prevent additional weeding. The one very last thing I do want to talk about that's outside of these three, and maybe it fits more into number one, is just when you grow, when you force in crates, it's obviously not natural in the sense that you're not, you're obviously not following nature. But one of the things that I was almost grappling with was, for me, becoming a flower farmer was really tied to my why in terms of supporting a more sustainable lifestyle. And I really questioned around just if I'm growing in crates and I need to potentially buy sterile potting mix because tulips are susceptible to disease, how sustainable is that? And I got to this point where I said, well, I know that in the winter, especially Valentine's Day, most of these flowers that we buy are imported, right? So the importation piece of it has two large pieces that are really unsustainable. One is that they're obviously sprayed with chemicals and all that stuff, and they have to be sprayed to meet custom requirements, the USDA pest requirements. So I get why it needs to be sprayed. We don't want to introduce pests and invasives, right? But then the second piece is think about the carbon footprint of shipping a flower. Think about the carbon footprint of a plane or boat, but then add on top of that the refrigeration that is needed, especially for something like a tulip. That carbon footprint is massive. So while you can argue that in some ways growing in a crate is not natural and it's not contributing soil health, net, nothing's ever black or white. I see it as still being a better sustainable option for local flowers than to, go with the status quo. But the other thing that made business sense was the fact that when you grow in a crate, you're not, when you harvest, it's a lot more efficient. And this was actually a point that we spent a few minutes on, which was that when Emily and Linda are harvesting these tulips, they're doing it basically in the winter time. And they said it's a really difficult transition for them to start going into the summer months where now they're harvesting from the field. They have to clean the stems, right? There's just a lot more. With tulips, there really shouldn't be pests. There might be diseases, but you are literally cutting at the stem. There's no washing needed because the crate is quite controlled in terms of just the soil remaining on the bottom, assuming that you do things right. So you're literally just cutting and you're bunching them up and then you're selling it as a bouquet, right? They're selling them in straight bunches. There's no other foliage needed. There's nothing else that you need to grow. Now you compare that to a market bouquet that you're selling in the summer. You've got at least 5 to 7 different components in there. You have to harvest them all potentially at different times. You have to, keep them in the cooler. Then you have to arrange them. It's just a different level of time and labor commitment for building a market bouquet versus forcing tulips in a crate or hydroponically, harvesting them and making straight bunches. It is literally like, we're talking about like threefold in difference in terms of productivity, in terms of how much less labor you need for the forced tulips, and also the premium that you can charge for fewer stems. So in this workshop, they talk about everything from which bulbs are right for forcing. There are actually some bulbs that they've trialed in the past that they don't recommend. So you get to skip the trial and error process and kind of follow what they have first. So they talk about bulb selection. Then they talk about, the infrastructure that you need, the cooling requirements, the rooting requirements, the growing requirements. They talk about diseases. They even talk about, what I appreciate about the in-person workshop was we actually looked at a crate of bulbs and we looked at, okay, this bulb is fine for soil forcing, but this bulb over here is a little bit too risky for hydroponic forcing. And this bulb here looks okay, but I would actually plant it in the field. So being a first-year cut flower farmer, I just don't have that experience, right? And bulbs are relatively expensive. It's not something you really want to screw up on. You don't want to spread disease everywhere. So that part of the workshop was actually really, really impactful for me. And I thought that the in-person option was just a lot more impactful than even the video piece, because, I can't really see it and get my hands on it and have that interaction with someone who's experienced to, go through multiple bulbs to learn. So they talk about disease, and then they also talk about marketing, right? How much you should be selling these bulbs for, what their market commands, some of the different types of structures, right? Linda does like a flower club. Emily sells to her local grocery stores at wholesale. So they talk about pricing and stuff. And then there's some bonus content. So really the soil or the tulip forcing is centered around in crates in soil as well as hydroponically. So for me personally, I will be growing tulips 3 ways for the upcoming season. I have some crates that I've already started, as you can see here. I literally did this the day after I got back from the workshop. I was so invigorated. I took the day off because I knew it was going to be a long drive back. And I was just like, I'm getting on it. I'm starting this. So even though it's not fully cool outside yet, we are getting into the 30s at night. I'm just going to start this process. I have actually 2 crates of bulbs in my refrigerator right now to get them to cool, but I will also be hydroponically forcing the bulbs. Now, I can't start hydroponically forcing anything right now because I don't have that cooling space, and none of the bulbs that I have right now have been cooled. So I will be getting a shipment of cooled bulbs. My first shipment will be in mid-November, and then my second shipment will actually be in January. The one in January will be bulbs that have had all of their cooling time, so I can get a jump start to hydroponically forcing, hopefully, if all the bulbs are in good condition. And the reason why I'm breaking it out into doing soil forcing in crates as well as hydroponics, and then I even put some out into the field, is because, first of all, I want to stagger when they're gonna bloom. So this is like succession planting. But then the other piece is I just wanna experiment with the different growing methods and seeing which one works for me, which ones I need to learn a little bit more from. So even with the crates, I am doing it in phases, because I wanna see if I start right now, mid-October, where the days are still in the 50s, but nighttime is in the 30s, does that still work as cooling time? So I think there's just a lot to learn from experience. And one of the things that Emily and Linda really encourage is trying things in a non-traditional way and screwing up and learning from it. Like, for example, someone asked, my husband proposed basically erecting a tent, like a camping tent up in our garage, putting the bulbs there so that the rodents don't get to it. Like, what do you guys think? And Emily's response was, that's thinking that we encourage, right? So you can tell that they're very much do whatever it takes to mimic the environment that they need or to prevent rodents from getting to them. Like, just try something different. And, her point was, if we didn't try anything different, we wouldn't be here right now. So, if you think about the scale that she's doing 200,000 tulips, I asked her, do you feel like you just can't grow enough? Is your market saturated? And she's like, there's always demand, and I just don't have the capacity to continue taking on additional growth. So the opportunity is there, and I'm pretty excited to trial this. I will definitely bring you along the way and show you whether or not the tulips actually come up, how I do in terms of sales. But again, it was called the Tulip Workshop, and it says with von Trapp flowers and little farmhouse flowers. So if you just go to Tulip Workshop, they're on Instagram. They also have a website. You can see what they're offering. I think right now they're taking enrollment for their lily class, but the Tulip Workshop will actually open up in January for registration for those who are interested. And when you do register, you get this course book around everything. So, you know, like you can, like, there's beautiful pictures. They talk about like their favorite varieties here, some photos. It really is a well done course, and you get the videos for life. They're always updating the course. So as a former online workshop participant, there's another workshop going right now. I can actually participate in their Q&As at the end of each section in case if I have more questions. And I also have access to an online Facebook group with other students, and Linda and Emily are pretty involved in that Facebook group. So if I had a question, they would also be able to answer it there too. So it just feels like it's a decent amount of support. It's a good amount of education. You know, there's obviously some expectation that you're going to trial it. But I think that there's also expectation on the participants front that, you know, this is not something you just like, let me get a few crates, let me get some soil and put some tulip bulbs in it, right? You do have to work to make sure that you get that infrastructure set up. So hopefully this video was helpful if you were considering either the Tulip Workshop, you had heard of it before, or you were trying to find something different. My goal is to stop growing in the summer. It was disgusting, you know, and I live in New Jersey. It's not even that bad, but it got up to like mid-90s. It's humid outside. There's an unbelievable amount of pests on the flowers, and then everyone else is growing flowers, right? Like, I don't want to grow flowers at that time. I want to focus that time on my personal vegetable garden. I want to be able to preserve food. So what that means is I want to use the shoulder seasons and potentially the winter for flower growing. So that's why this fits with my business and personal plan, right? Especially around the sustainability piece. But I also think it makes for an easier lifestyle, especially as someone who has a full-time job. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and hopefully I will see you next time.